Britain had envisioned a relatively small haven in Palestine for persecuted world Jewry, not a Zionist power dominating the region. As a result, before World War II, Britain restricted further immigration. All Zionists opposed such restrictions, but a Jewish terrorist organization, Irgun, went further. Headed by Menachem Begin, Irgun declared all-out war on the British through sabotage, assassinations, and bombings. Here are 2 British soldiers murdered by Begin's terrorists and booby-trapped in order to kill more British. Finally, in 1947, the British, sick of the thankless task of overseeing Palestine, scheduled transfer of Palestine to control by the fledgling, inexperienced United Nations. The UN resolved that Palestine be partitioned into 2 states, one Zionist, one Arab. Jerusalem was to remain an international zone to be enjoyed by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Partition was to take place on May 15, 1948. Of course, the UN had no right to give Arab property to anyone. Nevertheless, although Jews owned less than 6% of Palestine at that time, the UN voted to give most of Palestine to the Jews. Resolution 181 granted Jews 57% of the land. The Arabs, who had formerly occupied 94% of Palestine, now possessed only 43%. Yet even this colossal land grab did not satisfy the Zionists. They claimed all of Palestine. They resisted the idea of coexistence with a Palestinian state, just as they do today. As a result, 26 days before separate independence was to be declared for both Jews and Arabs, Zionist covert forces began a program of terrorism aimed at driving Arabs out of Palestine. The National Geographic tells us, at 4 o'clock on the morning of April 19, 1948, 132 Jewish terrorists from the Irgun and Stern gang fell upon the peacefully sleeping Arab village of Deir Yassin, west of Jerusalem. For 8 terrible hours, murder occurred until more than 200 men, women, and children lay dead, 15 houses dynamited. The corpses were piled in a nearby quarry and burned, and that pillar of black smoke has darkened the Jerusalem air ever since. Today, a hospital for the mentally ill covers the site. Many think that use appropriate. Irgun leaders like Menachem Begin, who was not present at Deir Yassin, have denied the accusation of atrocity. The deaths were a result of what he considered then and now a legitimate military action. Televangelist Dr. Jerry Falwell, a close friend and supporter of Prime Minister Begin, called Begin a great man of God.
The Deir Yassin massacre is credited with frightening Palestinians out of their ancestral homelands as no other Jewish tactic until that time had been able to do. Begin made it clear that not only were Jewish forces capable of such unthinkable atrocities, but they would repeat them again and again as long as Palestinians resisted. After May 15, 1948 arrived, roving Zionist trucks mounted with loudspeakers blared to the Arabs that if they did not flee immediately, they would be slaughtered. With Deir Yassin vividly in mind, and fearing a bloodbath all the way to the Jordan River, roughly 800,000 Arabs fled in panic. At the same time, now that their British protectors were gone, they appealed to their Arab brethren for help. Yet the Arab forces, poorly armed and ill-prepared, were no match for the aggressive Israeli army, supplied with the latest military hardware by the Soviets. When the war ended, Israel controlled 78% of Palestine. Thus the Arabs, after being promised by the British a national homeland in Palestine if they helped defeat the Turks, and being assured under the Balfour Declaration that Palestinian rights would be respected as equal with the Jews, and being scheduled by the United Nations to have their own independent state on May 15, 1948, the Palestinian Arabs ended up with none of these things. Instead, having lost their farms and businesses to the Israelis, more than 1 million Palestinians were herded into internment camps, where they and their children would learn to hate Israelis, Christians, and the treacherous West for the next 50 years. Following the so-called Jewish War of Independence against the Arabs in 1948, Israel seized, without compensation, between 90 and 100% of the Arab and Christian homes and property in cities of Palestine it now controlled. Most owners, which included a high percentage of Christian Palestinians, were forced to find refuge in slums or refugee camps, never allowed to return.
Zionists have been able to seize Arab lands and property in Palestine and drive out their occupants because of the romantic, pseudo-biblical idea that Jews have a God-given right to live in the land, even if disobedient to God. This premise, coupled with intense sympathy for Jewish sufferings, blurs and desensitizes the Christian West to what it really means in human terms to be a Palestinian Arab. It is difficult for us to imagine what it is to lose house, land, and livelihood in order to make possible the Jewish Christian dream of a national homeland for the Jews. What if tanks and bulldozers appeared at the end of your street? What if the bulldozers actually leveled your house? What if you and your family were trucked far away to live for the next 50 years in a ramshackle tent city amid squalid, subhuman conditions, dependent upon charity from the United Nations? If you can imagine such an outrage, maybe then, for the first time, you can actually understand what it feels like to live inside the skin of a Palestinian. For this is exactly what has happened to the Palestinians again and again and again throughout this century. Zionism, peace proposals, partition, all meant one thing: loss of homes, land, and livelihood. If you as an American were huddled in the cold of a refugee camp, and you knew very well that it was Christians who had given the government the moral authority to have your home bulldozed, would you not do everything in your power to oppose Christianity? Physical resistance for you might not seem out of the question. Rather, it might be the only way to hold back the aggression and get the attention of an indifferent world.